sit-in would be more effective than the demonstration, because demonstrations just go an inch, and letters you just get maybe 4 or 5 inches of full explanation of what you're doing. And in Illinois, during the Vietnam War, we were much more effective in electoral politics with McCarthy and George McGovern. In fact, the Democratic Congress caucus in the House voted against funding for the war, despite the fact that McGovern lost, that McGovern had just demonstrated enough strength in election districts across the country at the grassroots level that the congressman knew that next time up they would see challenges to their congressional seats in the congressional districts where McGovern successfully elected delegates. They saw the handwriting of the war. They voted to cut off the funds in the Democratic caucus in the House. And the day after that, Nixon signed the peace treaty and ended the war. So that was the effective way, electoral politics. But here, people, like, went to a Chicago teaching for peace and justice yesterday, and they're chortling over 10,000 people blocking one street in Chicago. And they're using that as a big victory. But the government could easily use an alternative street, run tanks down the street to mow people down. That's totally a symbolic victory. These demonstrations don't accomplish anything. In Illinois,
Pierre, I'm going to let you go. Thanks. You made your point.
One part of what you say I completely agree with. Just demonstrations, not connected with day-to-day ongoing educational and organizing activities, are pointless. But take the case of the Vietnam War, which was dragged out. In that case, I think the evidence is pretty strong that the demonstrations were very effective. They were part of exactly what you're suggesting should be done. They were part of day-to-day organizing educational activities, and the demonstrations grew out of them, stimulated other people to join, made other people understand what was happening, contributed to the activism, which ultimately, after many years, led to the appearance of political figures who were willing to become, the leaders of or the official leaders of what was by then a mass popular movement. And that was after years and years of very hard work, including demonstrations. And I think there's very strong evidence that they were successful. If you want to have some direct evidence for it, in 1968, after the Tet Offensive in January 1968, the business world turned strongly against the war because it was becoming very costly to the United States. It was becoming costly because Lyndon Johnson was never able to call a national mobilization of the kind that was called during the Second World War, which led to a very efficient economy. He wasn't able to do that because there was too much discontent. They had to fight what they called a guns and butter war, which led to stagflation and economic problems. The discontent was the result of activism, including demonstrations. Johnson was essentially, there was a real power play from the business world. He was essentially told to call off the war after the Tet Offensive, which indicated it was going to go on for a long time. He wanted to send 200,000 more troops to South Vietnam. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were opposed. The reason, they said, was because they thought they would need the troops for civil disorder control in the United States, where large segments of the population were just getting out of hand. They mentioned women, youth, minorities, others. This is in the last part of the Pentagon Papers, worth taking a look at. The disorder and the discontent revealed themselves in many ways, demonstrations being a very visible part, but much more than that. And the appearance of politicians, Eugene McCarthy's a good case, was much later, and only when there was a mass base for it, then the politicians appeared. Before there were a few. Grinning and Morse were two, but very few until a mass popular movement had developed. And I don't really agree with you about the demonstration. I mean, it can be, if it's not done properly, yes, it can be destructive. You can say that about anything. The demonstrations on February 15th around the world were they're the biggest mass demonstrations in history, I suppose. They were so significant that actually the New York Times, a little unhappily, in its comment on them, said a day after that there are now two superpowers on the planet, One is the United States, meaning the U.S. government. The other is world public opinion. Well, world public opinion was visible on February 15th, and that led to the recognition that there's a powerful force there that has to be dealt with. It didn't stop this war, but there's never been protest like this against a war at that stage. You're quite correct in your account of how long it took to build up protests to the Vietnam War, which actually started in 1962. This protest was before the war had actually started. That indicates a major change in consciousness and understanding in the country, and it's the basis, I think, for developing significant popular movements which will impede and I hope reverse the use of violence in world domination and control. But it doesn't happen in a day. And your point about day-to-day explanation, work, leafleting, and so on is absolutely correct. Unless that's a central part of the activity, demonstrations don't mean anything.
Jerusalem, Rhode Island, good afternoon.
Hi, sir. Anti-terrorism bills were rushed through Congress in the days after the Oklahoma City bombing and have been extended since September 11th. The problem is that clearly some of those bills had been written and printed before the bombing. Already the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force has issued flyers urging the public to call for information about possible terrorists, defenders of the U.S. Constitution, and those people who would make numerous references to the Constitution or attempt to police the police and lone individuals. I believe this is an undermining of basic democracy, and I believe that the FCC rule change that is proposed for June 2nd that would allow the media companies such as Clear Channel Communications to be able to purchase newspapers will limit the free press. As a novelist, I believe that you probably also support not allowing these large media companies like Clear Channel to be able to purchase newspapers on top of radio stations, since 2 out of every 3 households are reached by 6 major media companies. As a novelist, do you support the free press, or do you support this media rule change that Mr. Powell, Michael Powell, who is the son of the Secretary of Defense Colin Powell, for some unusual reason, but it has been alluded through Alice in Wonderland and the World Trade Center disaster, written by David Icke, what that relationship between Mr. Powell and Michael Powell and the government's hidden agenda to eliminate basic civil liberties are. Do you support this media rule change by the FCC?
Thanks, caller.
Yeah. Well, on the specific question of the, you brought up many interesting points. On the specific question of the FCC ruling, I'm on your side. I don't think that, I think that the planned ruling will increase the tendency towards centralization and monopolization of media, which is a very bad thing. It's been going on for years. Quite apart from this, the major monitor of the study, the regularly published study which deals with this, is Ben Bagdikian's book, The Media Monopoly. I think the first edition of it must have been about 20 years ago. And he then identified, if I remember correctly, about 50 major concentrations of media in the country. The last edition, which was a year or 2 ago, I think it was down to under 10, and the FCC ruling will reduce it even further, not in the print media, but including the print media, in fact. I think it's a very bad thing. We want as diverse a press as we can get. I don't think that's the only problem with the press at all, but it's a problem. On the other issue that you raised about anti-terrorism legislation and civil liberties, here I think we have to be, we have to have a certain caution. Terrorism is a serious issue. I mean, personally, I don't object when I pass through security at the airport. I think that's, you could argue about the details, but that's something should be checked makes sense. On the other hand, the Justice Department, the Bush Justice Department, has claimed rights which are incredible. If they are implemented, it is a major attack on civil liberties, and to an extent they have been, and to an extent they've even been upheld by the courts. I mean, they've claimed that the executive has the right to imprison people, including citizens of the United States, to hold them without trial, without charge, without access to family and lawyers, and to do so indefinitely until the president declares that the war on terror is over, which means indefinitely. There's a new act under discussion, Patriot 2 it's sometimes called, which includes provisions that would grant the Attorney General the right to actually withdraw citizenship, rescind citizenship, on what's called inference. The Attorney General's inference from some pattern of behavior that the person supports terrorists. I mean, this is utterly outlandish. No free and democratic society should tolerate anything remotely like this. There are, what's happening in Guantanamo is absolutely shocking and has been condemned by every human rights and civil rights organization throughout the world, and maybe getting worse. I don't know, can't authenticate it, but there are now reports in the British press and Australian press that there are plans for, and it's been the British Foreign Office has agreed that it's correct, that there are plans to have execution chambers in Guantanamo where people can be executed without anything remotely resembling a fair trial on charges that, and without proper legal representation or anything like that. These moves are really shocking, and we should be, you're right, that we should be deeply concerned about them. I might quote, if I can remember the wording, a comment by Winston Churchill about this. Churchill's bust is on George Bush's desk. He looks at it every day. Churchill he said that something like this, to place a man in prison without charge and without the judgment of his peers in a fair trial is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian governments, whether Nazi or communist. Churchill said that in 1943 when he was opposing efforts to institute preventive detention for alleged intelligence purposes. And in 1943, Britain was in pretty dire straits. It was under attack by the most vicious and murderous military machine in history, and its survival was not obvious. Nevertheless, he took that position, which is correct, and he's right. What's now being proposed is, and in part implemented, is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian societies, whether Nazi or communist, and we should be deeply concerned about that.
Here's some of the 98 books that Noam Chomsky has published over the last, I guess what we're talking about, almost 50 years. American Power and the New Mandarins, a new foreword by Howard Zinn. This was 2002 when it came back out. There's one called World Orders, Old and New by Noam Chomsky. Remember the year this was out?
First published in 1994, and there's an expanded edition in 1996.
And here's another one, Deterring Democracy. It was a national bestseller. Can you still buy this one in the stores?
I don't know if it was a national bestseller. I doubt it.
That's what it says right up at the top.
Well, you should know never to believe anything that's put by a publisher on a cover. That was 91, extended 92.
Most of these still in print?
Yeah.
Carlsbad, California. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Yes, sir. I'm a military officer with 25 years of experience who's read Mark Twain's War Prayer. And I got a couple of quick questions for you. And I'd like to know whether or not you think it's perfectly natural for a country to protect its borders and guard its national interests, whether they be protecting the population against terrorism or securing economic interests. And in the case of radical Islamic terrorism, that we might have had to burst the terrorist bubble in the wake of a failure of diplomacy. And that wasn't necessarily our failure, looking at their motive, intents, and consequences. And that's the first part, if I could come back to you after that.
Well, should a country have a right to defend its population And its economy, yeah, certainly. I don't think that's a question. I didn't exactly understand what you meant about the Islamic terrorism.
Well, given the war in Iraq, that we were over there perhaps in the face of radical Islamic terrorism.
No, there's no, look, that was a fabrication. There is no evidence whatsoever. I mean, Saddam Hussein's a horrible monster, just as he was when he was supported by the United States, the people now in office in the 1980s. He was a hideous monster. Osama bin Laden is another hideous monster, but they're different monsters, and they hate each other. And there's no evidence whatsoever any meaningful evidence of a connection between Saddam Hussein's horrifying regime and the networks like Al-Qaeda. They despise each other and have had no known connections. The only effect of the war in Iraq on terror is that it has, as predicted, increased recruitment for Al-Qaeda. So it's increased the threat of terror. Exactly as predicted by intelligence agencies in the United States and throughout the world and other specialists. But the idea that attacking Iraq had something to do with the war on terror is just mendacity.
Quick follow-up, Carlsbad.
Yes, sir. Thank you. With respect to foreign policy and the potential for peace in the Middle East, do you think that first world countries, which have a tremendous ability to provide resources and aid to developing countries, can promote peace in the face of Arab humiliation and overcome Israeli defensiveness?
Well, we have to ask. There's here I think we might listen to the leading specialists on the topic, namely from Israeli intelligence. So the former chief of Israeli military intelligence just pointed out in a book in Hebrew that until Israel is willing to treat Arabs with respect as decent as human beings with rights, there will never be an end to terror. 20 years earlier, a former head of Israeli military intelligence, Yoshat Harkabi, said essentially the same thing. He said, until we deal with the legitimate grievances and demands of the Palestinian people under military occupation, there will always be the threat of terror. He was writing at a time when Israel was virtually immune from terror from within the territories. Just in the year 2000, the head of the Israeli secret police, Shabak, the general security services which control the occupied territories, essentially said the same thing. He said, until we deal with the legitimate grievances and demands of the Palestinian population under occupation, we will never put an end to terror. So the humiliation is there, and the degradation is there, and the repression is there, yes, it does lead to sometimes to terror, certainly opposition. And incidentally, if we want to look ourselves in the mirror, as we should, this goes way back. George Bush is not the first president to ask, why do they hate us? Almost 50 years ago, President Eisenhower, in internal discussions with his staff, which have since been declassified, discussed what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not by governments, which are on our side, but by the people. And his National Security Council gave an explanation for it. They said that there is a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports corrupt and oppressive regimes which block democracy and development, and that we do it because of our interest in controlling the oil reserves of the region. And furthermore, they said that perception is correct, so it's very difficult to counter. And they said, yes, we have to continue doing it. You hear the same feelings expressed today, even by wealthy Muslim managers of multinational corporations. They perceive the United States correctly as supporting brutal, corrupt, repressive regimes that are blocking democracy and development. And yes, that leads to antagonism and often hatred. It's not the source of Osama bin Laden, but it is the reservoir of background that the heads of Israeli military intelligence and the secret police were talking about. We have to be serious about that if you want to stop terrorism. I mean, the same is true elsewhere. Take, say, Northern Ireland. As long as the British responded to IRA terror with just escalation of violence, it increased the terror. When they came to the point of beginning to deal with the legitimate grievances, it did improve the situation enormously. It's not a utopia, but it's much better than it was 10 years ago.
Stamford, Connecticut, for Noam Chomsky. Hello.
Yes, Mr. Chomsky, I share your views and revulsion at much of U.S. foreign policy, and I think you're right. Once you understand it, it's irrefutably cruel, evil, and ruthlessly self-interested in many, many, many instances. And I find you to be an invaluable voice of criticism and dissent, yet your views almost never appear in the mainstream media. Do you feel you're censored at some level by the mainstream organs in this country?
Well, I wouldn't call it censorship. You're right that I don't appear in the mainstream media, and not just me, but the same is true of other critical voices. The media do, in fact, reflect a pretty rigid and, I think, narrow spectrum of opinion. And if you don't belong to it, you don't appear there. It's not censorship, it's their choice and decision.
Sharon, Pennsylvania, you're on with Noam Chomsky. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I have some disagreement, but most agreement with you. And one of the it's in the point that I feel you don't go far enough. For instance, just on the last point, for instance, NPR. I've read that even when you're speaking to a smaller audience at American University, from which NPR broadcasts this Diane Rehm show, you've been barred from that program, even when you're very conveniently to be interviewed. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the chairman of NPR is the former head of all CIA propaganda foreign broadcast, and the head, for instance, of PBS is the former head of Voice of America. Now, when you've got that on the supposed alternative to the corporate media, the big business media, which is interlocked and owned by military-industrial weapons manufacturers and colludes with the CIA, I think there is quite a bit of censorship. And I do read your stuff on ZMAG.org, like a previous caller, and it's very useful, and I think that it doesn't go far enough in many cases. For instance, you claim that somehow it's not plausible that the administration or a faction within intelligence supporting the administration had prior knowledge and saw that the only one that would benefit from this attack in 9/11 would be the warmongers within the Bush administration and the police state factions within the Ashcroft Justice Department. I think is belied by the fact, and this gets to the media, that James Bamford, the top NSA expert who wrote the book Body of Evidence, points out from declassified State Department and Pentagon documents that in the early 60s, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Undersecretary of Defense had plans to terror bomb American cities, murder American citizens, even bomb an American ship in Guantanamo Harbor to frame up Cuba, to blame Cuba for these U.S. Government-planned bombings, and then use it as a pretext to invade. Now, there is a real precedent there. It was only called off by the Kennedy administration because apparently they figured that it might go awry. But it shows that there are these clones of this very fanatical ultra-right faction, almost duplicate at that time within the high levels of government that correspond to this Bush administration with its plans for world domination.
Thanks, caller. Mr. Chomsky.
Well, what you're referring to is Operation Northwood. It's declassified. You can read it if you like. It was a contingency plan called at the request of the Department of Defense, and it did have roughly the character you described. But if you look at contingency plans, they are all over the map. They've got plans for everything, and it was not implemented. And it wasn't the only one. There were other plans that came from the more liberal sectors of the Kennedy administration. For example, plans to stage what would look like a Cuban invasion of Haiti, which could then be used as a basis for invading Cuba. Actually, that one came from Arthur Schlesinger, way over at the liberal end. But from looking at contingency plans by governments, I don't think you can conclude very much. On the 9/11 event, you have to make a crucial distinction between two things. The earlier question, at least as I understood it, was whether the Bush administration was involved in planning it. For that, I think it's outlandish. The question you're asking is whether there could have been foreknowledge of it. Well, that's conceivable, but then we have to be a little cautious, because remember that in 1993, almost 10 years earlier, there was an attempt to blow up the World Trade Center, which came very close to succeeding. And if it had succeeded, would have caused tens of thousands of deaths. Since that time, there was no doubt in the intelligence community that operations of this kind were possible and might take place. Whether there was any foreknowledge of this one, I haven't seen any convincing evidence of that, but it's conceivable.
In a moment, we're going to take a break, and our guest, Noam Chomsky, is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania with a BA, an MA, and a PhD. Got out of there in 1955, has been at MIT since 1960?
55.
Actually 55, and has published a total of 98 books over these years. You have 3 children, Diane, Avi, and Harry.
That's right.
Where are each of them today? What are they doing?
Avi's the oldest is teaching at Salem State College near Boston, Latin American, specialist in Latin American history, teaches history. Diane, our second daughter, happens to be in Mexico at the moment, but is primarily living in Nicaragua, where she's been about 15 years, has her family there. Our son Harry, the third child, is living in the Bay Area, works in software engineering, that kind of thing.
We have about an hour and 45 minutes to go, and we'll be back with Noam Chomsky and more, and your calls in just a moment.
About 10 years ago, the United States had the highest wages in the world, which is what you'd expect. This is the richest country in the world by far, and it has absolutely unparalleled advantages. Real wages have in fact stagnated or even declined for the majority of the population since their peak around 25 years ago. But in the mid-'80s, the effects of the double-edged so-called conservatism of the Reaganites, namely markets for the poor and state protection for the rich, that hadn't yet had its full impact. By 1993, the impact was quite obvious. The Wall Street Journal was able to exult over what it called a welcome development of transcendent importance. Namely, U.S. labor costs had fallen below all other leading industrial powers, apart from England. We actually did fall below England for a while, but then Margaret Thatcher succeeded in driving the working people and the poor down even more efficiently than us. Meanwhile, profits were rising to new heights. Earlier this year, every year, Fortune magazine has the big business magazine, has a review of the Fortune 500, the 500 top guys. And earlier this year, they reported dazzling profits, that's their word, for the 500 top corporations, even though sales were stagnating. So wages are going down, sales are stagnating, and profits are zooming to dazzling heights, sometimes called a paradox. In fact, if you look at social policy, it's not terribly paradoxical.
Watching Professor Chomsky there from 1994, and he's here in our studios for the next 1 hour and 45 minutes, and we've got calls waiting to talk to him. This one from Omaha, Nebraska. You're on the air, Omaha. Please go ahead.
Yes, I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question. I think it's in line with what was just shown, a little talk you were giving about economics and stuff. I've been pretty deeply interested in socialism over the past 12 years, and I keep hearing that socialism is on the rise again in the U.S. At least within the universities and stuff. They say, always saying how all the faculties out east and west are more and more socialistic, and I guess I see as kind of the root of all the evil, all this imperialism and capitalism, economics, creating all these wars and terrorism, blah blah blah. I'd like to hear more of your commentary on the potential or what's going on realistically now in the U.S. and the world in terms of a true socialistic movement. In terms of like the working class really taking charge of economics potentially, rather than all this, to me, is what's screwed up versions of what is called socialism, through tax cuts and blah, 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 that they're going to redistribute, that's what you get through the mainstream media, that they're going to create tax cuts and redistribute it, and that's what they call socialism.
Thanks, Omaha.
Well, the tax cuts are a curious kind of socialism. I mean, the tax cuts are intended to, and having the effect of redistributing income even more toward the rich than is currently the case. In fact, the tax cuts are pretty clearly part of an effort to destroy the progressive legislation of the past century, including social spending in general, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, progressive taxes, and so on. That's virtually conceded. I don't know how closely you've been following the business pages in the last couple of days, but it's been revealed that the former Secretary of the Treasury, before he was fired, commissioned a study by the top government economists, Treasury Department, Bureau of the Budget, and so on, to estimate the likely effects of the Bush administration economic programs. That includes a vast increase in federal spending, primarily for the military, which means high-tech industry in general, and tax cuts directed primarily towards the most wealthy sectors, enormous tax cuts. They estimated deficits on the order of $44 trillion. That's a lot of money. That was supposed to be put into the February budget proposals, but didn't appear there. There's a debate about whether that was purposeful or not. Anyway, it's now revealed and conceded. The White House spokesperson, Ari Fleischer, was asked about it in a press conference a couple days ago, and he said, yes, the figures are correct. And then, paraphrasing him, he said something like this. He said, this means that Congress will have to be responsible in reforming Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, the kind of reform he's talking about is not funding it through reinstituting progressive tax measures, but basically killing it. They know that they cannot approach the population in an election on a platform saying, we're going to eliminate social spending and transfer wealth even more to the wealthy than it is today. But they can, and I think are intending to, drive the country into what a number of economists have called a fiscal train wreck, which will then have the effect of eliminating social spending. So this is about as remote from any, this is, it's government intervention on the for the benefit of the wealthy. Now, as far as socialism is concerned, that term has been so evacuated of content over the last century that it's hard even to use. I mean, the Soviet Union, for example, was called a socialist society, and it was called that by the two major propaganda operations in the world, the US, the Western one, and the Soviet one. They both called it socialism for opposite reasons. The West called it socialism in order to defame socialism by associating it with this miserable tyranny. The Soviet Union called it socialism in order to gain whatever, to benefit from the moral appeal that true socialism had among large parts of the general world population. But this was about as remote from socialism as you can imagine. I mean, the core notion of at least traditional socialism is that what you mentioned, that working people have to be in control of production and communities have to be in control of their own lives and so on. And you know, this goes, the Soviet Union was the exact opposite of that. Working people had no control over anything. They were virtual slaves. And the collapse of the Soviet Union is in fact a small victory for socialism, in my opinion. It eliminated one of the major barriers to it and should have been recognized as such. But the term has been, as I said, become so meaningless that it's hard even to use. If we use it in the traditional sense, which you brought up, that goes straight back in American history. You read the working class press in the mid-19th century, press published by artisans and what were called factory girls, young women from the farms working in the textile mills in eastern Massachusetts, which was the center of beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Their press was calling for, they said their theme was that those who work in the mills ought to own them. Wage labor, which was called wage slavery, was regarded by most Americans as not very different from slavery. Even the Republican Party regarded wage labor as just at best a preliminary to free labor, but intolerable because it's a kind of servitude. A large part of the northern population fighting the Civil War was fighting under that banner. This goes straight through the 20th century, the idea that people should be in control of their own destinies and lives, including the institutions in which they work, the communities in which they live, and so on. Call it what name you want, but that's traditional socialism. And there are today attempts to describe a kind of a detailed vision of the future based on these notions. The most extensive and detailed one I know is by Michael Albert at ZNet, which you mentioned. It's participatory economics, and there are other such proposals. But I think this is deeply ingrained in people's understanding and consciousness and barely below the surface. In fact, it's a call for essentially extension of democracy to the industrial sphere and to communities as well. We should also bear in mind that the leading American social philosopher, John Dewey, who's as mainstream as apple pie, his main work was concentrated on democracy. He pointed out over and over again that as long as we have what he called industrial feudalism, that is a tyrannical control, private power controlling production commerce, democracy will be very limited. We have to move to what he called industrial democracy if we hope to have significant democracy. As for politics, his position was that until that happens, politics will be the shadow cast over society by big business. And I think most of the population recognizes that and accepts it.
New York City, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Yes, hello, Dr. Chomsky. I heard you refer to your early experiences with Zionism. I imagine a more universal and idealistic Zionism from that period. And I was wondering if you could speak on the evolution of your relationship with Zionism and the State of Israel. And also, perhaps if you could speak on what your vision might be for an Israel maybe drawing on that more optimistic early Zionism, and how the process of getting to that vision differs from Oslo, Clinton, and Barack in 2000, and now the roadmap.
Well, this will have to be brief, but in this book that was mentioned before, Middle East Illusions, there's a lot of discussion of that. Some of the essays there go back to over 35 years, up to the present. But to try to put it briefly, at the time when I was a Zionist youth leader, an activist back in the 1940s. But for me, Zionism meant opposition to a Jewish state, and that was a recognized, accepted part of the Zionist movement. By no means a majority, but it was a position within what was called the Zionist movement, opposition to a Jewish state. And I think the reasons for that were good. The same reasons why I'd be opposed to a Christian state or a white state or an Islamic republic. Same reasons. A state should be a state of its citizens, and not of some privileged category of its citizens. And the State of Israel, incidentally, by High Court ruling, is the state of the Jewish people in Israel and in the diaspora, but not of its citizens. And I'm opposed to that. I've always been opposed to it. So in that respect, my views haven't changed. If this was merely a matter of symbolism, it wouldn't matter much. So the fact that the United States has a day off on Sunday, doesn't make it a Christian state in any sense that matters. But if there were special privileges for Christians or whites or others, it would be a different matter. Then I think we should be opposed to it, and that's true in Israel. After the establishment of the state in 1948, which the issue of the existence of Israel was essentially over as far as I'm concerned. It should have the rights of any state in the international system. I don't think states have many legitimate rights, but that's another story. But whatever rights you accord to any state in the international system, okay, Israel should have those rights. It should be democratic internally, meaning the state of its own citizens, not of the majority of them and other Jews elsewhere. After 1967, the situation changed radically. In 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank, Sinai, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. And since that time, this is now the 36th year of a quite harsh and brutal occupation, in which time Israel, when I say Israel, I mean the United States and Israel, because just about everything Israel does is by U.S. authorization and with U.S. Diplomatic, military, and economic support. They can't go much beyond what the U.S. authorizes. And what they have done is move to integrate the West Bank particularly into Israel to the extent that they want it. So there are massive settlement programs which have broken the West Bank into cantons effectively. And to get quickly to the Clinton-Barack programs at Camp David, they were you should take a look at the map of what was proposed. It's rather striking that while there was much talk about how magnanimous and generous